Wide on a river town at dusk, fog moving over slow brown water, 11 dark windows in a brick face at the end of a road that goes nowhere else. Closer now. A chain link fence, a collapsed rear porch, a young maple growing sideways out of the foundation, like the building itself has begun to give up. Closer still. Rain sideways under a torn awning across the street. A folding table, a ledger, a man with an auction hammer waiting on one last raised card. And there, at the edge of the awning, a girl no older than 23. Wet coat, cold fingers. A soft Motel envelope pressed against her hip with 2 words in blue ink on the front that nobody watching is meant to read. Beside her, an old man leaning on a cane he did not need until this month. The hammer lifts.
50,000.
Something scrapes inside the house. She raises her
50,000.
number. The auction hammer waited. The rain came sideways under the awning. Winifred Ashcombe held the numbered card against her hip like something she had already stolen. Her fingers were cold. The auctioneer looked past her once, then back, and his voice softened in the particular way people used with widows and confused teenagers. $700, he offered again. More slowly this time, for the whole bellwether property, as is. And then he asked, gentle as a doctor, whether the young lady understood what as is meant. Behind him the boarding house sagged toward the river. 11 windows, 3 plywood, 1 with no glass at all, just a black open mouth where the sash used to be. A strip of copper gutter hung from the eave like a crooked grin. The bricks were the color of old blood dried in a bowl. Moss ran down the south wall in a green stripe. Somewhere inside, something large scraped across a floor she had not yet stepped on. Winnie tightened her grip on the Motel envelope in her coat pocket. 3 nights. Her Aunt Margot had written across the front, blue ballpoint, neat cursive, as though labeling how long her niece and her grandfather were permitted to remain a problem. She told the auctioneer quietly that she understood. Ambrose leaned on his cane beside her. Rain shone in his silver hair. His shoulders were narrow inside the wool coat he had bought in 1996 and refused to replace. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since she was 8 years old, and standing in a hospital corridor with the news that her mother was gone, careful, present, not steering. Was she sure? He asked. She wasn't. That was the honest answer, and it slipped out of her before she could rearrange it. He almost smiled. That wasn't the answer she had given him on the bus. On the bus, she reminded him, she had been trying to keep morale up. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Nobody else had bid. Nobody else was foolish enough. The 2 brothers who wanted the lot had left after seeing the collapsed rear porch. The man in the canvas jacket had already climbed back into his pickup. A woman with a red umbrella had looked once at the front hall through the broken door and returned to her car without speaking. Winnie thought about her aunt locking the SUV doors before pulling away from the motel. She thought about the way the locks had clicked twice. Once for safety, once because Margot had not trusted herself to drive off if the doors could still open. Winnie had heard both clicks. She was not supposed to have heard them. She raised her number. Sold. The hammer came down softly on a piece of wet cardboard. It did not sound like triumph. It sounded like a small door closing on a room they could not yet enter. 2 weeks earlier, she had still owned a blue farmhouse outside Ridgefield, Ohio, and she had still believed her aunt was worried about her. The belief had not arrived all at once. It came in groceries, It came in phone calls after supper. It came in the way Margot and Corbin both began using the word safe, as if it were a bandage they were applying to something they had already broken. "You can't keep climbing those stairs safely. Winnie, honey, that old furnace isn't safe. What if your granddad falls when you're at work? What if you get dizzy again like you did that summer?" Winnie had not been dizzy. She had knelt on the kitchen floor after a 12-hour shift at the bakery and stayed there long enough to catch her breath. Margot had walked in the back door without knocking, found her on one knee. And by supper, the moment had become a collapse. By Sunday, it had become evidence. Now Winnie stood in the farmhouse kitchen, wrapping her mother's flowered serving bowl in newspaper. Corbin carried boxes through the mudroom. He had grown into his shoulders since the last time she had really looked at him. Tall, handsome in a loose, unfinished way, brown hair falling across his forehead, work boots expensive and remarkably clean for a man whose business supposedly involved construction. He was 32, and he still walked into her kitchen the way he had walked into it at 19. Like it owed him something. She didn't need all this, he informed her, not with the same warmth he had brought to the coffee, but the same certainty. He said it about the good towels, about her father's socket wrench set, about the cast-iron Dutch oven that had come from Ambrose's mother in 1961, about a framed photograph of Winnie's parents at Niagara Falls the summer before Winnie was born. Everything they owned had become too heavy, too old, too much trouble, or something Margot already had. She needed the bowl, she told him. He asked when she'd last used it. She named Thanksgiving. He suggested, mildly, that she could use Aunt Margot's dishes now. She folded another sheet of newspaper around the rim, which was when she noticed him at the counter. Corbin, standing at the cabinet above the toaster, opening the coffee tin where she kept her tip money from the bakery. $240 saved for a new set of paring knives, 40 in loose fives, 220s clipped to a receipt from the propane company. He closed the tin without taking anything. She asked what he was doing, looking for packing tape, apparently in the coffee. He put the tin back on the shelf. The lid was crooked. She noticed that too, because Corbin had always been careless with boundaries. He had borrowed jackets and never returned them. He had borrowed a truck and returned it empty. He had borrowed money at 19 and never mentioned the amount again. But lately his eyes moved around her house the way an appraiser moves through a foreclosure, adding, subtracting, estimating what remained. From the dining room, Ambrose called for Corbin in the voice he used when he wanted to change the temperature of a room without saying so, and asked for help with a chair. Corbin went. Winnie put her hand flat on the coffee tin and left it there until her palm stopped shaking. The farmhouse had been her father's parents before it had been her father's, and it had been her father's before it had been hers. She had grown up in the pantry doorway. She had learned to read at the dining room table. She had watched her mother die in the front bedroom when she was 8 years old. She had watched her father die on a 2-lane road outside Coshocton the summer she turned 17. Since then, it had been Winnie and Ambrose in a house that leaked at the roofline and groaned in January. And the two of them had made it work because they did not have another plan, and because neither of them wanted to be the first one to say the house had become too big. The sale had happened fast. A young couple had made an offer before the sign was properly planted. Corbin had walked her through the paperwork on his laptop at the kitchen table, one hand on the mouse and one hand tapping the counter, urging her to accept before the market shifted. Margot had agreed the number was fair. Ambrose had said only, softly, that Winnie should sleep on it. But Winnie was 23 and exhausted and surrounded by 3 people telling her this was the sensible choice. And she had signed on a Wednesday afternoon between the lunch rush and her closing shift. The money was supposed to make things easier, pay off the small balance her father had left on the house, settle Ambrose's hospital bill from the fall he had taken in April, contribute to the basement renovation Margot was building, leave enough for Winnie and her grandfather to breathe. And then Corbin had come to her with a red folder. He needed a temporary loan for his company. 2 clients were late paying. A supplier had raised prices. Payroll was due Friday. He would repay everything as soon as 3 pending jobs closed, which he swore was 6 weeks. 8 at the outside. She asked how temporary. He gave her the range. The amount was not small. Neither was the memory of him at 19, sitting at that same table after wrecking his first truck. Unable to meet her father's eyes. Winnie had been 16 then. She had watched her father write the check without a word, because that was what family did. Because Corbin was Margot's only son, and Margot was Winnie's father's only sister, and the thread had to hold. Ambrose had wanted to give Corbin half of what he asked for. Winnie gave him all of it. She signed the promissory note her cousin printed off his phone and slid across the table. She watched him fold it into the red folder and tuck the folder under his arm. She did not ask why a contractor with 3 jobs about to close needed to borrow from a 23-year-old baker who still counted tips into a coffee tin. She did not ask because she had grown up watching her father not ask. And not asking was the shape love took in her family. By evening, the farmhouse no longer looked like a home. It looked like a mouth after teeth had been pulled. The buyers would take possession Monday. Margot wanted Winnie and Ambrose settled before then, so they followed her white SUV east toward the suburbs in Ambrose's old brown Buick. And the last thing Winnie saw in the rearview mirror was the porch light Ambrose had forgotten to turn off. She almost asked him to go back. Instead, she reached across the console and put her hand on his wrist. He wasn't all right, he admitted quietly, but morale was a work in progress. Margot's house stood in a development where every lawn was the same shade of green, and every mailbox appeared to have been approved by a committee. Thurston met them in the driveway, wearing pressed shorts and a strained expression, and when Winnie stepped toward him for a hug, he turned the movement into taking her overnight bag. Big day was all he offered. He shook Ambrose's hand instead of embracing him. Margot spoke very fast about the basement not being quite ready yet, just cosmetic things, and led them down. The stairs were carpeted in something the color of oatmeal. The basement smelled of fresh paint and damp concrete and the artificial cinnamon of a wall plug-in trying too hard. The promised sitting area was crowded with a treadmill. Behind the treadmill stood 2 artificial Christmas trees, still wrapped in the plastic they had come home in. Stacked plastic tubs, a weight bench, a dehumidifier the size of a filing cabinet. And in the middle of it all, a mattress on the floor, made up with matching sheets Margot had clearly bought that morning. Ambrose stopped on the last step and pronounced it cozy, in a tone that meant the opposite. The bed frame was coming tomorrow, Margot promised, or Wednesday. Ambrose looked around for a bathroom. Upstairs, for now. Winnie looked at the small window near the ceiling. From where she stood, she could see a strip of lawn and Thurston's shoes. The rest was covered by a strip of privacy film. She wanted to know when the contractor would start. Thurston set down the overnight bag as if it had been heavier than expected. There had been a scheduling issue, he explained, and costs were getting out of hand. They needed to revisit the scope. Margot gave him a look Winnie had seen 100 times as a child. It said, "Not now." Thurston pretended not to see it. They needed realistic expectations, he added, meaning her grandfather. Not Winnie and your father, not our niece and my uncle, just they, like a weather system moving in. Ambrose lowered himself onto the mattress. His knee made a soft popping sound that he tried to disguise by clearing his throat, which fooled nobody who had ever loved him. Winnie sat down beside him and pretended not to hear the pop, because that was the kindness he was asking for. And it was the smallest thing she had left to give him that day. That first night, she woke up at 2 in the morning and could not remember where the bathroom was. She stood in the dark, listening to the dehumidifier hum. She counted the exposed heating ducts on the ceiling, because she needed something to count that was not the amount they had lost. She climbed the stairs on the outsides of her feet, which was a habit she had learned as a girl, trying not to wake her mother. And she pushed the door at the top. It would not open. Something scraped on the other side. Then Thurston's voice came through the door, low and irritated, wanting to know who it was. Winnie stared at the knob. The burglar who called him Uncle Thurston. She offered a pause. The lock clicked. He had secured the basement door out of habit. He explained, standing in his robe in the dark hallway, he always locked up before bed. He would try to remember they were down there. She walked past him without answering. She did not come out of the guest bathroom until she had stopped shaking. By the end of the third day, the rules had begun to appear the way mold appears, all at once and everywhere. The washing machine was available on Tuesdays and Fridays, but not after 7, because the pipes knocked, the thermostat was not to be touched. Ambrose's aftershave bothered Thurston in the mornings. The cast-iron skillet Winnie had brought from the farmhouse scratched the ceramic cooktop and could not be used. The Buick could not remain in the driveway because it leaked a drop of oil the size of a nickel. So Ambrose parked it on the street and limped up the slope every morning to sit in the driver's seat for half an hour, just to be somewhere that was theirs. Winnie responded the only way she knew how. She became useful. She cleaned the refrigerator without being asked. She ironed Margot's blouses. She cooked pot roast on Wednesday because it was Margot's favorite as a child, and she baked biscuits Thursday morning. And for a few hours, the whole house smelled like the farmhouse kitchen. Margot came home from work, took one long breath at the door, and rested her forehead against Winnie's shoulder. She had missed this. She murmured. Winnie's hand rose automatically to smooth her aunt's hair, because that was the shape love took. Because if she could just make enough biscuits, everyone would remember they had wanted her here. At dinner, Thurston ate 3 of them. Then he mentioned that bacon grease should never be poured down the sink. She had put it in a jar. Winnie told him, evenly. He was just saying. Then she would just say she had put it in a jar. Margot laughed, uncertainly. Ambrose kept eating. Thurston smiled the way a man smiles when he is deciding whether to press a point, and then he pressed it, softly, again and again through the meal. Small corrections about the salt and the placement of the trivet and the way Winnie had loaded the dishwasher wrong the day before. That night, she left the dishes in the sink because she was tired and because she was 23 years old and she had not signed up to be anyone's live-in wife. By morning, Thurston had lined the dishes up along the basement steps. Ambrose found them first. She heard porcelain knocking together, then the slow, uneven rhythm of his cane. When he reached the bottom, he carried the plates under one arm, awkwardly, like a waiter who had lost his nerve, and set them down as return mail. A yellow sticky note was pressed to the top plate. "Please respect shared spaces." Winnie peeled off the note. She placed it on the dehumidifier because it seemed like the correct home for something so small and so mean. She sat down on the mattress, and she started to laugh. She did not want to. She could not help it. Because the block letters were so careful, because Thurston had chosen a yellow sticky note, because in the whole time she had known him, she had never once heard him say the word shared out loud. Ambrose set the plates on the floor and lowered himself beside her. He had been disrespecting shared spaces for 51 years. He told her, and she should have seen the teacher's lounge after taco day. She leaned into his shoulder until the laugh became something quieter. The next afternoon, Margot placed 3 glossy brochures on the kitchen island. Silver-haired couples holding wine glasses beside flower beds, sunlight arranged professionally on their faces. One advertised maintenance-free senior living. Another promised graduated support. None listed a price. Margot was not saying now. She began. Winnie opened the first brochure. Then why was she saying it? Because good places had waiting lists. For what? For availability. For people to die. Winnie translated flatly. Margot flinched. Ambrose came in through the garage carrying a wrench and a wet rag. The powder room faucet had been dripping. He mentioned. Margot's face tightened. Had Thurston asked him to fix it? The faucet had asked him to fix it, Ambrose corrected. He had replaced a washer. The house remained structurally sound. Margot asked him to check next time. Ambrose wiped his hands and did not answer. Winnie flipped the brochure over. On the back, someone had written a number in pencil in the corner. 40,000. She stared at it. Then she looked up, and Margot was already crying. Quiet. Angry. Contained crying, both hands pressed flat to the counter, as if it were the only stable thing in the room. She couldn't do this, Margot whispered. Winnie went to her. Margot stepped back. That hurt more than the words did. She was trying, Margot said, quickly, like a person pushing something out of her mouth before it could hurt her. She had rearranged the whole basement. She and Thurston were fighting every night. Corbin kept telling her one thing, and Winnie told her another. And nobody had told her the renovation was going to cost $40,000. Winnie repeated the number, with the bathroom and the permits, and making it accessible. Yes. They had never agreed to $40,000. Margot stared at her. But Winnie needed a bathroom. They had one, Ambrose said quietly. At their house. Margot flinched again. Winnie pulled out a stool and sat down because her knees had gone strange and she did not want the room to see it. What had Corbin been telling her? Her aunt wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand. He had said Winnie would cover the renovation. From the sale. Winnie turned toward her grandfather. Ambrose gave one slow shake of his head that meant absolutely not. And Winnie's stomach dropped an inch because she knew already what had happened. She knew the whole shape of it before the words arrived. They had agreed to contribute, she said. They had never agreed to pay $40,000. Corbin had said there'd be plenty left after the mortgage. There was, before his loan. Margot's face went still. What loan? The garage door opened. Thurston stepped in with his phone still against his ear. took one look at their faces, and ended the call without saying goodbye. What had happened? Corbin had borrowed money from Winnie. Margot told him. Thurston gave a short laugh without any humor in it. Of course he had. He was repaying it, Margot added, without conviction. When? Thurston wanted to know. Soon. Was that the official date? He inquired dryly. Winnie disliked Thurston. In that moment, she disliked him more for sounding like her. She reached for her phone. She called her cousin. Margot put the phone on speaker before he answered. What? Corbin said. Machinery clattered behind him. A saw. A radio. Somebody laughing. His mother asked, calmly, for a woman going gray around the eyes, how much he had borrowed from Winnie. A pause. Why? Because Winnie was supposed to pay for the basement? No, they weren't, Winnie corrected. Corbin exhaled. Could they discuss this tonight? They were discussing it now. Thurston clipped in. Another pause. Different from the first. Corbin hadn't known Winnie was there. Clearly. He began explaining receivables, supplier costs, a commercial renovation that would put him ahead for the year. The more he talked, the less money seemed to exist in any account anywhere in the world. Margot interrupted him and asked how much. He said the number. She sat down. Thurston walked out of the room. Ambrose remained by the doorway, leaning harder on his cane than he wanted to admit. Corbin had said it was handled. Margot pressed. It was handled. He had said Winnie could afford the renovation. She could. She had another account. Winnie felt the room narrow to a slot. How did he know what accounts she had? A silence. He had seen the statements when they did the sale paperwork. That did not make it his to report. He had been trying to solve the problem. No, she corrected him softly. He had been moving her money around in conversations. She had to go. She ended the call. Nobody spoke. Margot pushed the brochures aside with the flat of her hand. Winnie's fingers were cold. Ambrose lowered himself into a chair as if the chair were much older than it was. Outside, the automatic sprinklers came on with a soft chunk, watering Margot's already wet lawn. On Friday morning, Thurston asked to talk. He stood in the kitchen with Margot beside him, their shoulders close but not touching. He said the tension was damaging their marriage. He said the basement was not ready. He said everyone needed space to reconsider the arrangement. Margot kept her eyes on the fruit bowl. For how long? Winnie wanted to know. Just the weekend. Her aunt offered. Corbin could pick them up Monday. He had said he'd make room at his place while they sorted this out. Ambrose looked at her carefully. Had Corbin said that to Winnie? Or had Margot left him a message? Margot looked up. He knew. Which was not an answer. They packed 2 suitcases. Ambrose carried his toolbox, even though it struck his bad knee twice on the basement stairs. Margot drove them 40 minutes to the Mill Race Motor Lodge beside the highway, and nobody spoke except the navigation system, which kept urging her, calmly, to make legal U-turns. At the office, Margot paid for 3 nights in cash. She wrote 3 nights across the front of the receipt envelope in her neat blue cursive and handed it to Winnie without meeting her eyes. Their room had 2 double beds, a humming air conditioner, and a painting of a sailboat listing on a purple sea. Margot set Winnie's suitcase beside the door. She would call tonight. Winnie waited. Her aunt hugged Ambrose first, then held Winnie tightly, almost desperately, as if she were trying to press an apology through the fabric of her jacket without saying it out loud. Love you, sweetheart. I know. Winnie answered. It was the answer Winnie had given her aunt her whole life, and until that day it had always sounded warm. This time, it sounded like the receipt for something. Margot hurried to the car. Winnie and Ambrose stood outside the room as she backed the SUV out of the lot. For half a second, Winnie thought her aunt might lower the window and say something else. Instead, the driver's side lock clicked. Then, the passenger. Then, the two rear locks. 4 small sounds, in sequence. As if Margot were sealing herself into a smaller and smaller room. Winnie heard them all. She was not supposed to. She did. Monday morning, Ambrose sat dressed on the edge of the bed with his toolbox between his shoes. At noon, Winnie called Corbin. At 2, she called Margot. By sunset, the packet of crackers from the vending machine was gone. Tuesday morning, Corbin sent a text saying his truck was in the shop. Margot did not answer at all. Winnie took the Motel envelope from her purse. She turned it over. She wrote down exactly how much money they had left, in blue pen, in her own careful handwriting, and the number looked both larger and smaller written next to Margot's 3 nights. $18,912. That was everything after the farmhouse balance. After Ambrose's hospital bill, after moving expenses, after storage, after Corbin's loan. After the check she had written toward Margot's basement before learning there was no contractor scheduled. Their pensions and her paycheck would not arrive for another 3 weeks. Ambrose read the number over her shoulder. They were not destitute, he pointed out. No! They were just standing beside the highway with nowhere to live, which was a more expensive condition than destitution. He almost laughed. He caught himself. Winnie called the bank. She did it sitting on the edge of the bed, with the phone pressed hard against her ear, watching Ambrose fold and unfold a paper napkin from the diner across the parking lot. Corbin had no authority to withdraw money from her account. He only had view access, because she had let him help her set up online statements when she opened it after her father died. She had been 17. She had signed everything he had put in front of her. The young man on the phone asked her a series of security questions. One of them concerned the name of her first pet, Chicken. She offered. A pause on the other end. He wanted her to repeat that, Chicken. He had been a dog. Ambrose looked up. Mean dog. Not mean. Winnie corrected without looking away from the phone. He had bitten the mailman one time, and the mailman had kicked him first. The young man waited politely through this evidence. Then he removed Corbin's access. He helped Winnie change the password. He directed her to the nearest branch to sign new signature cards. And then, in the flat, helpful voice of someone reading from a screen, he mentioned that he was seeing 2 recent transfers he would like her to confirm. 2 withdrawals of $2,500 each, 6 days apart, signed at the counter. She went very still. She had not signed anything at any counter. Ambrose stopped folding the napkin. The young man was going to flag them, he said, and he would like her to come in with identification as soon as she could. Did she also want copies of the signed slips? Yes, she managed. Her throat had closed around the word, yes, yes, please. She wanted copies. She wanted everything he could send her. She hung up. Ambrose looked at her the way he had looked at her when she was 8 and she had come out of her mother's bedroom for the last time. Honey, he said, very quietly. Corbin had signed her name. She whispered back, twice. At a counter, $5,000. Her hands began to shake, and she could not make them stop. She walked to the branch that afternoon because she refused to spend money on a taxi. Ambrose came with her. His limp deepened over the half-mile, and she regretted the decision without saying so. Inside the small suburban lobby, they moved almost everything into a new account Corbin had never seen. She withdrew $200 in cash. She folded the receipt into the motel envelope with the number. She asked the teller for a small safe deposit box for the farmhouse closing papers and the promissory note her cousin had signed. The teller slid the box's second key across the counter. Winnie held it in her palm. It was heavier than it looked. She did not know why that mattered, but it did. Because a key that stayed with you was different from a key someone else could take back. The teller wanted to know about paper statements. Yes, Winnie told her. To this address, to the motel, not to Ridgefield. Corbin called 4 minutes after she left the branch. She watched his name brighten the motel phone screen and did not answer. He called again immediately. He called every 12 minutes for 2 hours. Ambrose watched her not answer. He must have alerts. He observed. She agreed. And no, she was not going to talk to him yet. They ate eggs at the diner next to the motel and tipped like people who still belonged in the world. Winnie counted the tip twice before she put it down. A television above the counter was advertising luxury apartments in Columbus. The smiling residents appeared to own no books, no tools, and no winter coats. Winnie watched a silver-haired woman in the commercial open a spotless cabinet containing exactly 4 white plates. Where did she keep her flower bowl, Winnie wondered aloud. Ambrose considered. In storage. 2nd floor. Unit 12. She stirred her coffee. Her grandfather stirred his. They could rent a room. They could buy a trailer. They could go south. Ambrose vetoed the south absolutely without letting her finish the sentence. Because he had met Florida, she almost smiled. She had not smiled since Tuesday. It felt strange on her face, like a coat she had outgrown. Whitfield. Ambrose stopped with his fork halfway to his mouth. The name had come from nowhere, and from 19 years ago. Whitfield, West Virginia, sat on the Ohio River under steep green hills. Her father had taken her there 3 summers in a row when her mother was still alive, back when her mother was in remission and everyone had believed the remission would hold. They had stayed in a boarding house on Riverbend Road because Ambrose had known a man who ran it. Iron balconies, river fog, a diner where the waitress had called Winnie Sugar and had let her sit on a stool and sip a real Coca-Cola through a paper straw. Ambrose was not sure the town was still what it had been. The building would be old by now, older than him. And he was not. He added what a realtor would call move-in ready. She almost laughed. He almost let her. Back in the room, she opened the little used laptop from the bakery inventory, the one her manager had told her she could keep if she paid $20 for the charger. She connected to the motel's uncertain internet and searched Whitfield. The paper mill had closed. The population had fallen. The old hotel on Main had become senior apartments, and the rates were beyond anything she could afford. There was a pharmacy, 2 churches for sale, a diner called Odette's. Then she found the auction notice. The town was selling 8 tax-abandoned properties. Most were narrow lots and burned frames. The last listing was for a brick building at 14 Riverbend Road, Bellwether House, 11 rooms, substantial rehabilitation required, minimum bid $500. The photograph had been taken in winter. Weeds obscured the bottom windows. The rear porch appeared to be kneeling. Somebody had spray-painted a small crooked arrow on the front step, pointing at nothing. Ambrose moved closer. "No," he said, before she had even spoken. She hadn't said anything. She had gotten quiet in a specific way. It had 11 rooms. It had 9 windows. The others were behind the plywood or in the river. She enlarged the image. A faded sign still hung above the entrance. Only the letters ELLWET were legible. The auction was Thursday, she told him. Ambrose sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked tired, not old the way people meant when they lowered their voices around him, physically used up by the week. A purplish shadow marked the skin beneath his eyes. She wasn't suggesting they buy it. She added, "Good." She was suggesting they look. That was how her father had bought the blue sofa. The blue sofa had lasted 28 years. Her father had hated it for 27 of them. He had napped on it every Sunday. He had been waiting for it to die. She looked back at the ruined building on the screen. Grandpa. They needed somewhere to go by Monday. That place, he told her gently, was not somewhere to go. It was somewhere people had already gone from. The truth of it settled between them like a small cold weight. Ambrose looked at her for a long time. He did not argue. He had never argued with her the way he had argued with her father. And she thought sometimes it was because he was afraid one day she would stop coming home to him if he did. Finally, he asked how much the bus tickets were. They bought 2 one-way fares, $86 apiece. The clerk at the motel let them leave the Buick in the back lot for a week after Winnie paid cash and promised the oil leak was not environmental. They carried only the suitcases and Ambrose's toolbox. Everything else remained in Corbin's storage unit outside Ridgefield, including her mother's flowered bowl and the workbench Ambrose's father had built by hand in 1953. Margot called while they were sitting on the bench at the bus terminal. Winnie answered. There was no greeting, just fear disguised as irritation, wanting to know where they were. At the station, Winnie told her. What station? The bus station? Why? Ambrose was at the vending machine buying 2 bottles of water. He rejected the first one because it cost $3. Then he bought it anyway. Whitfield, Winnie said. Silence. Where was that? West Virginia. This was not funny. Margot informed her. Winnie was not laughing. Corbin was going to come get them when he was working something out. He had been supposed to work something out yesterday. Margot exhaled the way she used to when Winnie was small and had asked one question too many at bedtime. Winnie could have called her. She had Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Again. Margot pushed. Winnie closed her eyes. A bus hissed at the curb. People rose around her, lifting bags, checking tickets. A man in a Cardinals cap held the door for a woman with a stroller. How many times, she asked her aunt evenly, should a person have to ask not to be left in a motel? Margot's voice softened. Please come back. To the basement. They would figure something out. Had Uncle Thurston agreed? Another silence. Winnie nodded, though her aunt could not see it. Winnie nodded, though her aunt could not see it. It was a small nod, almost for herself. She loved her aunt. She ended the call before her aunt could use the old answer against her. The bus smelled of coffee and damp coats and an air freshener failing heroically near the restroom. Ambrose took the window seat so he could brace his knee against the wall. As Ohio flattened past them, Winnie expected panic. Instead, she felt the strange lightness of having disappointed everyone. At the first stop, Corbin left a voicemail. She couldn't just take off. He warned, call him back before she did anything else with the account. There were payments coming through, and they needed to talk. He was serious. Ambrose listened beside her, then nodded gravely and observed that Corbin was serious. That was reassuring. She deleted the voicemail. They reached Whitfield after dark. The station was a glass shelter outside a drugstore, not the small brick depot Winnie remembered. River fog blurred the streetlights. Half the storefronts were empty. The hills rose so sharply beyond the town that the buildings seemed pinned between stone and water. Odette's diner was still open. A broad woman with steel gray hair and forearms, like a mechanic, brought the meatloaf without asking whether they wanted gravy. Her name tag said, Odette. They were the bus people, she announced, sliding into a lean against the counter. Winnie asked if that was a category. In Whitfield, apparently, 2 people getting off a bus after 6 was an event. Odette had a smoker's voice, though Winnie never saw her smoke, and she moved with the speed of a woman who had been told more than once that she was too old to hurry. She looked at the suitcase beside Ambrose's chair. She looked at the toolbox beneath it. She looked at the motel envelope on the table between them. She did not ask more. The only room available for the night was above a bar 4 blocks over. Music thudded up through the floor until 2 in the morning. Somebody laughed outside their door at 3. Ambrose slept through all of it, the way he had slept through everything since Winnie's mother died. Winnie lay awake beside him and thought about the difference between leaving and being left. Rain began at dawn. The boarding house stood at the end of Riverbend Road behind a sagging chain-link fence. In person, it was larger and more wounded than the photograph. Moss climbed the bricks. The collapsed rear porch had pulled part of the gutter with it. A young maple grew from a crack near the foundation, its bark shining wet. A woman from the town office unlocked the fence and handed each visitor a paper waiver. Besides Winnie and Ambrose, there were the 2 brothers, the man in the canvas jacket and the woman with a red umbrella. The front hall smelled of wet plaster and animals. Wallpaper peeled in long strips. Mail lay swollen on the floor beneath a broken slat. Somebody had left 3 plastic buckets in the dining room to catch the ceiling, but it had been years since anyone had emptied them, and the water in them was black. Ambrose's whole manner changed. He stopped being the man who needed help on the steps and became the man who knew why the steps moved. He tested the rail. He examined the ceiling. He took a small flashlight from his toolbox and studied the basement walls with the concentrated silence he had once brought to every classroom he had maintained for the Ridgefield School District. He did not pretend the damage was minor. The roof was open over the back third. He cataloged for her, quietly. Plumbing had been drained. Maybe not soon enough. Wiring was old. Porch was finished. Foundation was ugly. But he did not see fresh movement. Could they live here? Not today. Soon. He looked at her. Depended what she meant by live. 2 ground floor rooms were mostly dry. The kitchen had a blackened range, a deep sink, and cabinets built when people expected wood to last. Upstairs, iron bed frames remained in several rooms. One held a wardrobe with no doors. There was no treasure, no intact furniture worth selling, nothing waiting to rescue them from the price of repairs. In the dining room, the rain tapped into the 3 old buckets in a steady, uneven rhythm. Winnie stood beneath a water-stained ceiling and imagined the long table that had once occupied the center. She could almost hear plates, chair legs, a child's laugh, an argument about whose turn it was to wash up. Ambrose watched her. They would need paid help, he warned. A lot of it. She knew. He couldn't do a roof. She knew. 18,000 could disappear in a building like this before you got one working toilet. She knew. He leaned on his cane and looked around. She was still doing the quiet thing. The auction took place under the awning beside the town offices. Rain dripped from the edge in a thin gray curtain. The brothers bid 500, then 600. Winnie raised her card at 700. They looked at each other. They did not bid again. The man in the canvas jacket was already back in his pickup. The woman with the red umbrella did not bid at all. The auctioneer warned her about the condition. Ambrose asked her, softly, if she was sure. Something scraped inside the house. Winnie said no. And then she raised the card anyway. The hammer came down on the wet cardboard. She signed the purchase receipt at a folding table under the awning. Her hand shook, not from triumph, but from the very clear understanding that they had just traded a temporary emergency for a permanent one. Ambrose folded the receipt and tucked it into the motel envelope beside the number she had written down. At least, he offered, looking across the street at 11 dark windows. Nobody could complain about his aftershave now. She wondered aloud whether it had hot water. He wasn't convinced it had cold water. The woman from the town office gave them a ring with 4 keys. Only one of them opened anything. She also gave them a list of utility numbers and advised them to replace the front door lock. Had somebody been getting in? Probably. People. The woman glanced at the broken upstairs window. Among other things, the thing that had scraped inside the house turned out to be a raccoon. He appeared on the staircase when Winnie opened the front door, large and offended, with plaster dust across his back. For several seconds, they regarded each other. Ambrose lifted his cane and invited him, cordially, to move on. The raccoon did not move on. He knew Winnie couldn't catch him. He did not know she did not intend to. They propped the back door open. They made a great deal of noise with a dented pot found in the kitchen. The raccoon retreated up the stairs, crossed the second-floor hallway, and finally departed through the broken window with an ease that suggested he had been paying no rent for some time. First eviction, Ambrose observed dryly. They could not move in that night. The front lock barely worked. The water was off. And darkness turned the building from damage into threat. Winnie paid for 2 more nights over the bar. Each time she opened her wallet, she heard the boarding house chewing. She sat on the edge of the strange mattress and took out the motel envelope. The receipt for $700 was folded inside now, tucked against the number 18,912. She uncapped the pen. She wrote a new number underneath, then another under that. Bus tickets, front door lock, hardware. 2 more nights above the bar. Meatloaf at Odette's. Tip included. Ambrose watched her write. She was keeping score. Honey. Keeping track. Same thing. No. Score was for people who thought they were going to win. He almost smiled at her. She almost smiled back. Down the hall, a door slammed. Somebody laughed. The neon sign of the bar flickered against the wet window and painted the wall a soft, bruised pink. Winnie thought about the coffee tin, about the 2 forged signatures, about the 4 small locks clicking on the SUV as Margot backed out of the motel lot, about her aunt's neat blue cursive on the front of the envelope in her hand. 3 nights. Winnie turned the envelope over. On the back, above her list of numbers, she wrote one word, hours. She underlined it once. She did not underline it twice because she was 23 years old and she had lived long enough to know that things you underline twice tended to disappear. Ambrose put out the lamp. In the dark, above the neon and the river and the ruined roof of the house that was now, somehow, hers. Winnie listened to the rain. The rain did not answer. The rain did not have to. Rafael Cortez arrived on foot the first morning. He came out of the river fog like a man who did not want to be surprised by the house before the house surprised him. Canvas jacket, boots laced tight, a leather tool pouch on his hip that had been worn to the color of old honey. He stopped at the fence, looked up at the 11 windows, and did not smile. Odette had sent him. He explained. Winnie was on the porch with a broom she had bought that morning for $4. Sent him for what? To tell her whether this building was going to kill her before Christmas. Ambrose came around the side, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the man's tool pouch. He looked at his boots. Then he looked at his face. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. Two men who had spent most of their lives inside walls, other people paid them to fix, recognizing each other. Mill electrician, Raphael offered, before Ambrose could ask, how long? 26 years. Then the mill had decided it could make paper somewhere cheaper. Now he did whatever anybody needed, mostly for cash, sometimes for a hot meal. Winnie set the broom against the rail. She did not know yet that she was watching the shape of the next year walk up her steps. She only knew that Rafael Cortez was 58 years old and standing very straight, the way people stood when they had been down for a while and were pretending they had not. He walked the house without offering opinions he had not earned. He studied the breaker panel in the basement with a small flashlight. He touched the porcelain of a knob and tube junction so gently that Ambrose winced anyway. He shone the beam into the crawl space and made a sound in his throat that was not a word and was not encouraging. When he came back up, he named a price. Disconnect the worst circuits, test the ground floor lines, install 3 working outlets. It was less than Winnie had feared, and more than Ambrose had wanted to spend. She asked when he could start. Tomorrow. She proposed half now. Half when the outlets worked. He nodded once. He did not smile. He shook her hand. His palm was dry and warm and calloused across the base of every finger. And there was a small scar on his thumb she thought might have been a burn from long ago. He did not linger. He did not ask her age. He did not ask where her parents were. She noticed both of those things, not asking, and she noticed the not asking felt like a small door being held open. After he left, Ambrose brushed dust from the panel and asked whether she trusted the man. No, but she had hired him. She trusted half of him. Which half? The half that had quoted her a price without looking at her grandfather first. Ambrose almost laughed. He did not. The Roof brothers came in a truck that had rust across the wheel wells and a ladder tied on with orange rope. They agreed to tarp the open section, patch the worst of it over the parlor, and pull down the hanging gutter. $650. Winnie almost said no. Then rain began tapping somewhere behind the basement wall. She paid the deposit. By late afternoon, they had spent more than twice the purchase price of the building without producing a single working light. She wrote every amount on the back of the motel envelope in blue pen. 700 for the property. 86 times 2 for the bus. Hardware store, 134 including the lock. Electric deposit, 100. Water deposit, 75. Roof deposit, 325. 2 more nights above the bar, 140. Ambrose read the list over her shoulder. She had forgotten lunch. They had not had lunch, which explained why he could hear her stomach from where he stood. They walked to the diner. Odette took one look at them and set 2 bowls of chicken soup on the counter. They had not ordered. They had also not eaten. That information had come from Raphael. That information, Odette informed her without turning around, had come from their faces. She moved down the counter before Winnie could object. At the register, she charged them for 1 bowl. Winnie paid for 2. Odette discovered the extra by feel and tried to tuck it back beneath Ambrose's water glass, saying not to make her insult them, which was Odette's way of saying, please. They came back to the house at dusk. Raphael was already in the basement. He had left a small hand-drawn diagram on the kitchen counter, showing which circuits were dead and which were dangerous. The paper was smudged along one edge in the shape of a thumbprint that did not quite come clean. Ambrose looked at the diagram for a long time. The man was good. He told her. She knew. He was also sleeping in that appliance shop. She glanced at him. How did he know? Because the man's shirt had been washed in a sink. He had been washing shirts in sinks since 1968. Winnie folded her arms. She did not answer because there was nothing to answer with yet. She only knew that the price of a room in her house was going to be the first real question the house asked her, and she did not want to give it a bad answer. The utility company restored water the next morning. For 3 hopeful seconds, nothing happened. Then Ambrose shouted from the kitchen, and water sprayed from beneath the sink in a bright silver sheet. And another leak began upstairs, and it ran through the dining room ceiling and landed on the floor with a sound like applause. Shut it off, he called. Winnie ran outside. The utility man was already gone. The curb valve required a special wrench she did not have. Ambrose crawled beneath the kitchen sink with his bad knee extended behind him. The mains shut-off was stuck. Winnie went for the pry bar. Together, they forced the old handle until it moved. The pipes groaned. The spray weakened, became a stream, became a drip. Ambrose rolled onto his back on the wet floor, soaked from the chest up. Silver hair plastered to his forehead. He blinked twice at the ceiling like a man surprised to still be alive. Cold water, he announced. Winnie leaned against the cabinet, breathing hard, and started to laugh. Not because it was funny, because if she didn't laugh, she was going to sit down on the wet linoleum and cry. And she did not have time to cry. Question answered. By nightfall, the kitchen line held. Raphael had come back mid-afternoon and worked without much conversation. He replaced a scorch junction. He ran a new hot line to a single-wall outlet in the parlor. When he flipped the breaker, the lamp glowed for a full minute before Ambrose remembered to exhale. They were still a very long way from a working shower. They were less far than they had been at dawn. Raphael packed his pouch and stood in the doorway. He looked at Winnie. He looked past her, at the parlor, at the 2 folding cots she had bought at the hardware store, at Ambrose's coat spread across one of them like a very small quilt. She was staying here tonight, he observed. Yes, he nodded once. He did not offer to stay. He did not offer advice. He walked back toward the appliance shop by the tracks, and Winnie watched him go until his shape disappeared into the fog. And then she went inside and locked the new deadbolt herself. That was Tuesday. Wednesday, she met Estelle Bright. Estelle came in through the front door without knocking. The way a person comes into a place she has already decided is hers whether it agrees or not. Navy work pants, white shoes with a scuff on the left toe, a jacket over pale green scrubs, silver braids pinned at the nape of her neck, tired eyes that had seen the whole night shift and were now looking calmly at the peeling wallpaper of Winnie's front hall. Odette said Winnie would have rooms. Winnie dried her hands on a towel that was already gray. Odette said a lot of things. She had said that, too. Estelle Bright was 66 years old. She worked the 7 to 7 at the rehabilitation hospital across the river. Her cousin had passed the month before after 3 years of home care that Estelle had done alone. The cousin's house had gone to a nephew who had made it clear, in careful legal language, that Estelle was not part of the inheritance. There had been utility bills in Estelle's name. She had paid those. There had not been a lease. That, she said, standing in Winnie's dusty hallway, had been stupid. The bluntness of it landed close. Winnie thought of promises made at her father's kitchen table. None written down, because family was supposed to make writing unnecessary. She thought of Corbin sliding the promissory note across a table, and how strange it had felt at 17 to sign a piece of paper for a boy she had been raised to call brother. Where was Estelle staying now? Her car. Ambrose came out of the kitchen. He looked at Estelle. He looked past her, through the front window, at the dark green sedan parked beneath a maple. The back seat neatly packed with folded clothes in 2 lidded plastic tubs. How long? Long enough. Estelle reached into her jacket. She took out a small spiral notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She could pay $400 a month. She said, once there was a locking door and legal power, she did not need pretty. She needed quiet between 7 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. That was when she slept. Winnie could not promise quiet. Estelle needed her to try. Winnie looked at the stairs. The dry front room upstairs had an iron bed frame, a damaged sash, and a floor she would need to scrub 3 times before she asked anyone to remove their shoes. It also had a door with a working lock, and it had a window that looked at the river. They were not taking money today. Winnie told her. Estelle had not offered any today. But if they wrote down her name, Estelle held out the notebook. She did not make arrangements with buildings. Winnie was welcome to write her own name, too. That was the first agreement Winnie ever wrote for the Bellwether. She typed it at the public library, on a computer that made her wait 6 minutes to log in, and she paid 20 cents a page to print 2 copies. $400 a month. Quiet hours, kitchen shared, no overnight guests without notice, 30 days notice from either side. She read it twice on the walk back. She corrected 2 typos with a pen borrowed from Odette. Estelle read every line. She did not skim. She did not flatter. When she reached the last page, she took out a fine-tipped pen from her own pocket and signed her name in a hand that had been trained by decades of medication charts. She paid $100 in cash for the first week. She asked for a receipt. Winnie's hand shook a little while she wrote it. Estelle pretended not to see. Moving Estelle in took 15 minutes. Everything she owned fit in the sedan. She carried the plastic tubs herself. She allowed Ambrose to take only the small lamp with the pleated shade. And when he was halfway up the stairs and his breath had shortened, she took the lamp back from his hands without comment and pointed at the folding chair Winnie had dragged upstairs that morning. Sit. Ambrose was fine. He could be fine in a chair. He sat. Estelle placed 2 fingers against his wrist. She counted silently, her lips moving without sound. And Winnie watched her grandfather's face soften in the way it had never softened for a doctor. Had he taken his blood pressure medicine today? Yes. What time? He looked at Winnie. Winnie looked at Estelle. Estelle nodded once, satisfied he was lying, and told him to go unpack the suitcase. She closed her door and locked it. 2 days later, Rafael Cortez moved in across the hall. He brought 1 duffel bag, 3 shirts from a water pipe, a hot plate, the wooden crate he had used as a table in the back of the shop. He signed the same agreement Estelle had signed. Winnie gave him a written labor credit of $225 against the front room wiring, calculated by the hours and materials he had listed on a piece of graph paper. And he paid the balance in cash. No security deposit, he added, until the rear circuit was done. They had not discussed a security deposit. She added it to the notebook. Under his name, she wrote the words she was already beginning to understand were the ones that mattered. Read the agreement. Signed. 2 lines, in her own careful hand, as if writing them down could keep them true. The nights turned colder. The old boiler ran in short, angry bursts, heating the front rooms and almost nothing else. Winnie bought 2 window panes and postponed the used washer she had almost bought instead. Ambrose repaired sashes at a table made from a door laid across sawhorses. He could work seated. He could measure twice. He could curse with precision. Winnie sanded beside him. Her phone rang in her coat pocket. Corbin. She let it ring once before she answered. He needed her to transfer $5,000 back into the old account. No hello. Automatic payment coming out. For the company. She hadn't repaid the first amount. He had told her the jobs were closing. Then he should pay it from the jobs. He exhaled. She could hear the shop behind him. She could hear a radio that was playing the same country station her father used to play in his own truck. It stopped her for a second, that small ambush of childhood, and she pressed her thumb hard against the edge of the sash to bring herself back. If the payment bounced, Mom, he warned, it created a problem. She was not his mother. He knew that. He said it anyway, because in his mouth the word was a lever. He had used it since he was small, whenever he wanted her to be older than she was, whenever he wanted her to fix a thing he had broken. And once, in a moment, she still remembered. He had used it when she was 11, and her actual mother had just gone. No, she told him. That loan was part of his cash flow now. That loan was a loan. She corrected him quietly, not an allowance. She had spent $700 on a condemned building. It wasn't condemned. That was the part she objected to. He had objected to everything they owned when he had to move it. Ambrose stopped sanding. Corbin lowered his voice. There were other people there. She could tell, on his end. He was moving somewhere quieter. Were there people there? With her, 2 tenants. She was renting rooms, residents, to strangers. He had left them at a motel after knowing them her whole life. He did not get to lecture her on strangers. The words came without heat. Their calmness startled her. Corbin said nothing. She continued, "Bring back Grandpa's workbench and send the first payment he had promised." She could not do both. The bench did not belong to her. She had to go. He ended the call. Ambrose stared at the unfinished sash. He did not defend his nephew. He did not soften the moment. He picked up the sandpaper. The glass went outside. He told her, "Put a towel under it," so the edge didn't chip. They worked until the light failed. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked as Estelle prepared for her shift. Raphael tested the new rear wiring in the basement. The water heater grumbled. Someone opened the cooler on the porch and complained, cheerfully, that the ice had become soup. For the first time, the noises did not make Winnie afraid a stranger had entered. They meant people were home. The burst came 4 nights later. It was the kind of cold that finds every gap you thought you had fixed. The wind came off the river, and it moved through the crawl space, and it found the pipe Ambrose had insulated on Tuesday, and it found the vent he had only half blocked, because his knee had locked while he was down there. And the reach beyond the vent had been an inch too far. And he had come out of the crawl space and told Winnie the vent was done. And she had believed him, because he was her grandfather, and because she had been so grateful for his hands. Near midnight, the cold woke her. Ambrose was asleep on his cot in his coat, turned away from her. The house creaked. The wind pressed against the patch windows and hummed there. And something below the floorboards went sharp, like a branch breaking under snow. A second crack followed. Then, somewhere toward the rear, a rushing sound she felt in her sternum before she heard it. Raphael's door opened upstairs. "Maine," he shouted down. Ambrose was already reaching for his cane. Winnie's bare feet struck the freezing floor. She ran down the hall with her heart in her throat, and the house seemed to fill, immediately, with the roar of water inside walls. She grabbed the shutoff beneath the kitchen sink. It would not move. "Pry bar," she gasped. "Toolbox," Ambrose answered. The toolbox was in the parlor. Raphael was already coming down the stairs with a wrench in one hand. He was in work pants and unlaced boots and an open coat. No shirt beneath. Estelle came behind him in a robe that she had probably slept in on nights she did not want to be found, tying it at the waist without hurry, because Estelle Bright did not run. Together, Raphael and Winnie forced the valve. It turned a 1/4 inch and stopped. Ambrose lowered himself to the wet kitchen floor. He wedged the handle of his cane against the valve. He pushed. His face went the color of old bone. The valve gave. The roar inside the walls weakened. The water continued, pouring from the ceiling near the rear stairs. Raphael ran toward the basement. Ambrose tried to follow and slipped, and Winnie caught his coat, but not his weight, and they both struck the cabinet hard. Pain shot through her shoulder. She heard him say he was fine before he had checked whether he was, because that was what he had said her whole life. He was on the floor, she reminded him. He could be fine on the floor. That joke was used up. She helped him up. Her shoulder screamed. She did not say so. Estelle brought towels from her own room. Winnie almost said no, because the towels were nicer than anything the house had earned. And Estelle turned her head very slightly and looked at her. Once. And Winnie shut her mouth. For 2 hours, nobody discussed blame. They moved furniture, filled buckets, wrung towels into the bathtub, swept water toward the rear door with a push broom Ambrose had bought that afternoon for exactly this reason, and had joked on the way home that they would never need to use. Raphael opened part of the rear wall to release trapped water. He worked with the calm of a man who had done this in other people's basements at 3 in the morning, more than once, without being paid. By the time the sky above the river turned gray, the floor was quiet. The rear circuit was dead again. 2 of the 3 original outlets had shorted. The water heater had survived. The dining room ceiling had a new dark stain shaped like Michigan. Ambrose sat on a folding chair with a towel across his shoulders and looked, for the first time since she had known him, like he was 74. She sat beside him. She did not touch him, because touching him at that moment would have said something she was not ready to say out loud. Ivor Cobb arrived at 8, in his red suspenders under a heavy coat, carrying 2 coffees. He looked at the split pipe. He looked at the half-blocked vent. He did not scold her grandfather. His silence did the work. The repair required removing several feet of old galvanized line and replacing it with insulated copper. Ivor wrote a number on his pad. Winnie looked at it twice. "Half now." "Half now," he agreed. "The rest at the end of the month." Ambrose spoke from his chair, telling her to take it from his. It was all theirs. He had made the decision. They had made plenty of them. Not that one. Ivor cleared his throat. He could come back after lunch. No, Winnie decided. Do it now. Ambrose went to the parlor. She found him sitting on his cot, holding the foam board he had cut 2 days before. One edge was marked with careful measurements he had never gotten to use. He could have reached the other side. He told her, 10 years ago. She leaned against the doorway. 10 years ago. This hadn't been their pipe. That was not the point. No. He turned the foam board in his hands. She had not seen his hands look old before. She saw it now. His knee had locked. Honey. He had sat down. He had thought if he sat a minute, it would release. Then she had come back, and he had said almost, "Grandpa," that had not been the time to protect his pride. She sat down beside him. The cot creaked under them the way it had every night for a week. She looked at the wet cuff of his pants, at the deep line the folding chair had pressed across the back of his knee, at the callus on his thumb where he had held every screwdriver of her childhood. She did not scold him. He had already scolded himself. Instead, she said the things she had not been ready to say. She could not afford for him to lie to her. He nodded once. He knew. Honey. Not because she was angry, because she needed him to be true. So she knew what she was standing on. He knew. He rested his head against the wall. Morale. Terrible. He laughed. Once. Without opening his eyes, she rested her head on his shoulder. The house dripped somewhere behind them, softly. The way old houses always drip, because water finds the low place, whether you have found it yet or not. Ivor finished the pipe. Raphael refused payment for checking the wiring, but charged for replacing the ruined junction box. Winnie almost objected, then stopped herself, and asked him to write her an invoice. He studied her a moment. Was she sure? No. Write it anyway. 2 days later, Odette Marchand walked in without knocking. She carried a folded eviction letter under one arm, a peace lily under the other. And she was accompanied by a cast-iron skillet in a canvas tote, as though the skillet were her attorney. Her landlord had sold her building. Winnie set down her broom. She was sorry. If Winnie shopped for sorry, Odette warned, she was leaving, despite everything. Winnie smiled. Odette Marchand was 62. Her hands were the color of birch bark. Her opinions were the color of iron. She sat down at Winnie's kitchen table without waiting to be asked, put the plant on the counter, and looked at the room like a woman auditioning a house that had better audition back. His name was Mr. Franklin, she informed the room, pointing at the peace lily. Winnie looked at it. The tips were brown. He was dramatic, Odette confirmed. Miss One watering, and he played dead. There was a room, second floor. The corner one leaned. Character. Gravity. Ambrose came in and heard the last word and looked pleased. Odette looked at him the way Estelle had looked at him. Winnie thought, absurdly, of a small parade of women deciding, in careful sequence, how much protection her grandfather was going to be allowed to refuse. Odette read every page of the agreement. She argued about kitchen storage. She demanded a written promise that no one would touch her cast iron. She negotiated a lower first month in exchange for painting her own room yellow. She signed her name in a hand that had written more receipts than most people had ever written. Winnie added her name to the notebook, under Estelle and Raphael. 3 names now under one roof. She stared at the list for a long time after Odette had carried Mr. Franklin upstairs. She was 23. She was 3 names deep, and she could feel the pressure of that number the way a person felt weather in a bad joint. Percy Vane arrived the following Monday. He came out of the noon rain in a red wool scarf wrapped twice around his neck. Tall, narrow, gray mustache trimmed carefully. A suitcase that had crossed more places than Winnie. He said he had worked freight yards, hotel kitchens, and 1 season on a riverboat. His stories were charming, and they were slightly different every time. Between arrangements, he explained. So were they. He laughed like they had become friends. He wanted the second-floor rear room, the one at the edge of the dry section. Raphael had restored power there. Ambrose had repaired the latch. The walls were unpainted. The floor sloped toward the window. Character. Percy called it gravity. Ambrose corrected without looking up. Percy read the first paragraph of the agreement. He took off his glasses. His pension deposit came Friday. He explained. He could pay $150 now. Balance then? Winnie took Ambrose into the hall. He could pay Friday, she offered quietly. He could say Friday. He was 61. Grandpa. That was not a resume. He needed somewhere to sleep. So had Raphael. Raphael had rewired the house. Not everyone was an electrician. That wasn't her point. But she could hear, already, that it was becoming her point. She could hear herself deciding to be moved. She could feel the muscle in her that had opened the door for Estelle and Odette and Raphael being asked, gently and dangerously, to open it again. She watched Percy standing in the room by the window, looking out at the river with a face that had gone quiet. She recognized the expression. It was the expression of a person feeling a door close between him and the weather. He needed somewhere to sleep. Grandpa. Ambrose looked at her a long moment. She had already decided. Winnie. The accusation was true, which made her resent it. Which meant it was doubly true. Percy paid $150. He received a receipt. He carried up a suitcase, a cafeteria ID from a hospital 2 hours east, and an expired driver's license. He waved so cheerfully she almost forgot to notice it was expired. He made coffee for the whole house the next morning. He used the last of Raphael's grounds and left the pot on the burner until it burned dry, and offered it as an accident. Raphael unplugged the machine without answering. Friday came without the balance of Percy's rent. Deposit delayed, he explained. Holiday processing. There wasn't a holiday, Winnie pointed out. Bank observance? Of what? He spread his hands as if she had caught him at something small and forgivable. She gave him until Monday. That Sunday he cooked supper. He made potatoes, onions, and sausage he said he had bought with his last cash. He told a story about feeding a stranded train crew during a blizzard. Raphael asked where. Percy said Pennsylvania. 2 hours later, he said Kentucky. Estelle buttered cornbread across from him without looking up and observed that he had lived a lot of places. Hard to keep him down. He grinned. Hard to keep him anywhere. Percy laughed loudest. He washed every dish afterward and polished the stove and sang softly while he did it. When Winnie went to bed, she stopped in the doorway of the dining room and saw him asleep in the repaired chair, his glasses folded on his chest. In sleep, his charm slid off his face and left something exhausted and much older behind. She covered him with a blanket, because that was what her mother would have done. Wednesday morning, his suitcase was gone. So was the red scarf. His room contained 1 coffee mug, 2 wire hangers, and the room agreement folded neatly beneath the mattress. He had written 2 words across the bottom. Thank you. He owed her $250. Nothing else was missing. She checked twice, ashamed both times. Ambrose stood in the doorway. He did not say I told you. That was worse, she muttered. He raised an eyebrow. Him not saying it. He was learning. Well, she said. Stop for a minute. Did she want him to say I told you? No. Good. He wasn't going to. She stripped the bed. Percy had spilled coffee on one sheet and turned the stain toward the mattress. That detail, more than the empty room, was what almost made her cry. She did not cry. She threw the sheet at her grandfather instead. He caught it against his chest and laughed. She tried to remain offended, and then she laughed too, briefly, without pleasure. The unpaid rent mattered. It was almost the cost of the ruined junction box. More than the number, it damaged her faith in her own judgment. She had thought she saw herself in Percy, stranded, proud, in need of one door that would close. Perhaps she had. That did not mean he would pay. Corbin's next call came at 10 that evening. She recognized the tone before he began, the tightness across his throat, the small pause before the money. He needed $5,000 back in the old account by tomorrow. She turned Estelle's notebook to a fresh page. No, Winnie, no. Corbin. That farmhouse money was supposed to support family. It had supported her, she reminded him. And it had supported her grandfather. And it had supported him. For 8 weeks, she was spending it on strangers. She was spending it on residents. He laughed the way a person laughs when he has decided to try a different lever. She knew what people were saying. Right. No. What people? About her judgment. 23-year-old bakery girl buying a condemned building in a town she didn't live in. Renting rooms to homeless people. Residents, she corrected softly. Whatever she called them. She looked at the ceiling of her front room. Above her, Estelle's steady tread. Above her, a body of a woman who had cared for a dying cousin for 3 years and been paid in eviction. She thought of Estelle's fine-tip pen, of the way she had signed her name. Corbin, she said quietly. He had called her a bakery girl. He hadn't meant it that way. He had meant it exactly that way. Silence. She could hear a shop radio behind him. Country station. Her father's station. Corbin. What? She had moved the accounts. She had closed the online access. She had the copies of the signature slips. The silence that followed was different from the first silence. It had a shape. "Winnie," he began. "Don't—" He could explain. "Don't—" She ended the call. She sat on the folding chair beside her grandfather's cot and looked at her own hands and watched them stop shaking. Ambrose watched her without speaking. Then, softly, he acknowledged she had told him. She had told him. Good. She nodded. She did not say the other thing yet. The other thing was still growing. Odette came down the next afternoon and said the whole house was hungry. And Winnie said she would make grilled cheese. And Odette said that would be an insult to bread and instructed Winnie to sit down. She did not sit. She stood at the counter because she did not know what to do with her hands. Odette did not comment. By late in the week, Winnie had begun asking Odette quietly if she could make coffee when the Roof brothers came, if she could put out soup when a prospective tenant arrived at lunch, if she could reheat a plate for Wesley Prine, the dispatcher who worked 4 in the morning to noon. When he stumbled in at 10 smelling of diesel, Odette did. Once, twice, 5 times, 10 times. Then, on a Tuesday morning, when Winnie called from the doorway that the men from the tree crew were here, and could Odette put on more coffee, Odette did not answer. She set down a paring knife on the cutting board. She wiped her hands on her apron. She turned very slowly. Winnie had made her work public. She told her. The kitchen went still. Raphael stopped in the hall. Estelle looked up from her tea. Ambrose stood at the door with a strip of molding under his arm and did not move. Winnie tried to speak carefully. Odette had paid rent. She hadn't signed up to feed everyone. Odette knew what she had signed. She had signed a room agreement, not a job description. Winnie hadn't meant, she never meant, she just decided. Winnie's throat went hot. Odette, please. Winnie had decided she was the cook because cooking was useful to her. She was a cook at the diner where she got paid. She wiped her hands again on the apron, although her hands were already dry. She had eaten meals other people made in this house and thanked them. She had not handed them tomorrow's menu. Winnie thanked her. No. Winnie praised her. Those were different. Winnie glanced at the doorway. Ambrose was watching. Estelle was watching. Raphael was watching. Nobody moved. This should be private. Winnie said. Winnie had made her work public. Odette got to answer it public. A long silence. Then Winnie said the wrong thing. If Odette was unhappy here, she could leave. The moment the words existed, she wanted them back. Odette went very still, not the still of an old woman. The still of a woman who had heard those words before, in the voice of a landlord, in the voice of a boss, in the voice of a sister. She untied her apron slowly. She hung it on the hook by the door. She walked upstairs. She did not slam. The restraint was worse. Winnie stared at the cast-iron skillet on the stove. Raphael crossed the kitchen without looking at her and went out the back door. Estelle took her tea and moved to the dining room and pretended to read a piece of mail addressed to a person who no longer lived at the address. Ambrose set down the molding. Go apologize, he told her. She had embarrassed Winnie in front of everyone. Winnie had told her to leave in front of everyone. Winnie turned on him. Whose side was he on? He looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in his face. There was something worse. There was recognition. He was on the side, he said carefully. where they did not become the people who put them in a motel. She flinched. He flinched too. He did not take it back. Upstairs, a drawer opened and shut. Odette was packing. Winnie stood in the kitchen and understood, with a coldness in her chest, that if she waited for Odette to calm down, she would be assigning her the repair. She climbed the stairs. Odette's door was open. The cast iron pans had been removed from the nails Ambrose had installed for them the week before. They were stacked on the bed like a small dark tower. Mr. Franklin waited in the yellow armchair. Winnie knocked on the frame. Odette did not look up from folding the apron. Did Winnie want witnesses for the apology? No. Then close the door. She did. She sat on the bare edge of the mattress. Her hands went between her knees. She stared at the cast iron pans and made herself say the true thing before the easy thing. She was sorry. Odette folded an apron. She had made Odette's generosity into a job. Odette did not answer. She had not asked because she thought knowing Odette meant she did not have to. A pause. Odette lowered herself into the yellow chair. Winnie continued, and her voice cracked. And she let it. She liked being needed. She said she knew how to be needed. That was how she had stayed in that house with her aunt. That was how she had stayed useful when her mom got sick. When her dad died, it was the only way she knew how to be inside a room with other people. Odette watched her. Then she got angry when people needed her too much, because she never told them there was a limit, because she did not know how. Odette's eyes were dark and steady. She had done that with her aunt. She had thought if she made enough things easy, Margot would understand what it cost her without her having to say. Margot had understood things were easy. Yes. And now she was doing it from the other direction. She was making all of them useful, and she was calling it belonging. Mr. Franklin's leaves trembled as Odette adjusted the pot. She had been useful to her landlord, Odette said. 12 years. She had collected packages for him, let repairmen in, cleaned the hall when his cleaner quit. He had still sold the building. Winnie was sorry. That apology, Odette suggested. Winnie could keep. Winnie nodded. She would pay for the food she had already used, and for any cooking the house asked her to do from now on. Or Odette could say no. No explanation. Odette looked at the stack of pans on the bed. She hated moving. So did Winnie. Yellow paint was expensive. It was... Odette sighed and told her to put the lunch on the work list. She would quote her. They came back downstairs together. Ambrose and Raphael and Estelle were at the table. No one asked. No one performed relief. Odette pulled her apron from the hook by the door and tied it again. That evening, the residents drafted new rules together. Rent was reduced for any full day a room lacked heat, water, or safe power. Labor credits required a written estimate approved before the work began. No one moved in the same day they applied. Residents received notice before anyone entered their rooms, except in an emergency. Cooking for the house was optional and paid, with food costs shared and labor named. Winnie wrote every rule twice. What the resident owed, what the house owed. Rules went both directions. When she was finished, she looked up at the 4 faces around her table. Nobody clapped. Nobody thanked her. Raphael simply pushed the notebook back across the table with his knuckle. Now she had a house, which was the closest thing to a benediction she had heard in her whole life. 10 days later, a rented cargo van stopped outside. Winnie was in the parlor stripping wallpaper. She saw the headlights through the front window, and she went very still. She had known this was coming. She had not known when. Margot climbed out alone. She was thinner than Winnie remembered. Her hair was pulled back. She wore a coat Winnie had never seen her wear. She walked to the back of the van, opened the doors, and stood there for a moment before Winnie saw what was inside. Ambrose's workbench, wrapped in moving blankets, filling the whole cargo bed. The maple top she had watched her grandfather run his palm over 1,000 times as a child, when he was thinking, when he was tired, when he did not know how to say the next thing. Margot came to the porch carrying an overnight bag. She had brought back what wasn't theirs, she said quietly. Then she looked at Winnie for the first time. There was no plan in her face, only tiredness. If Winnie had a room, she would like to pay for one. Ambrose did not move. The others rose from the table. Raphael put on his coat. Wesley, the dispatcher, tightened his boots. Estelle found gloves. Odette went for the ramp. Ambrose stayed in his chair, staring through the window at the shape inside the van. Winnie went to the porch. She could feel the whole house behind her, waiting to see what she would do. She looked at her aunt. She did not step forward. She did not step back. They had a room, she said. Rent was $30 for the night. Agreement was at the table. She would read it. She would sign it. Same as everyone. Margot nodded once. Very small. Yes. She followed Winnie inside. They lowered the ramp. They eased the bench from the van. It took Raphael, Wesley, Ambrose, and finally, at the last stubborn corner, Winnie, gripping one edge with both hands until her injured shoulders screamed. Ambrose ran his thumb along the maple top. New drill marks, a dark burn near one edge. He said nothing. They carried the bench into the ground floor room. Its legs were uneven. Ambrose found a folded square of cardboard on the floor and slid it beneath one foot without looking up. Then he opened the center drawer. His father's wooden-handled chisels were gone, all but one, the half-inch, still in its slot, its cutting edge sharpened at the wrong angle. By someone who did not know how, Margot spoke very quietly from the doorway. Corbin had the rest. Ambrose did not answer. He picked up the one chisel. He turned it in his hand. He looked at the burn on the maple top. He looked at the empty slots in the drawer. Then he set the chisel down, very gently, exactly where it belonged. Margot's eyes were on him. She had told him she was bringing back what wasn't theirs. She said, he had told her this was... Winnie looked at her aunt, at the coat she did not recognize, at the overnight bag that had one strap and had been packed in a hurry, at the neat blue cursive she now knew, and had always known, went with a hand that could write 3 nights on a motel envelope and drive away. Come inside. Aunt Margot, she said in a voice she barely recognized as her own. Pay Odette for supper. Read the agreement at the table. Margot came inside. Winnie shut the door. Outside, along River Bend Road, the fog began to lift off the river, thinning against the black shapes of the closed storefronts, thinning against the lit sign of the diner 2 blocks up, thinning finally against the 11 windows of a boarding house that no longer looked entirely dark. Later that night, when the residents had gone to their rooms, Winnie stayed at her grandfather's workbench for a long time with a single chisel in her hand. She turned it over. The wooden handle was smooth where a man's thumb had rested for 50 years. She opened the bottom drawer. It stuck. She worked it free with her palm. And there, wedged under a strip of old shelf paper, was a thick, folded envelope her grandfather did not know had ever been in his own bench. It was not addressed to him. It was addressed, in her father's handwriting, to her. She sat down on the floor of the small room, in the cold, in the ruined boarding house on Riverbend Road, and slid the envelope open with her thumb. Inside were 3 spiral notebooks, and on the cover of the first one, in her father's careful blueprint, one sentence: "If you ever need to know what family cost us, honey, start here." Winnie sat very still. She held the notebooks against her chest. She did not open them yet. She could hear her aunt upstairs, moving softly, the way a person moves in a room she has not earned. She could hear Ambrose breathing on the other side of the wall. She could hear the boiler beneath her feet, alive and complaining. And beyond all of that, faint and steady and cold, the sound of the river. Winnie closed her eyes. Above her, along the front of the house, a piece of loose flashing tapped against the eave in the wind. Once, twice, 3 times. Like something knocking to come in. Winnie opened the first notebook on the floor of the workbench room. The cover was soft with age. Her father's handwriting slanted the way it had always slanted, a little tired to the right. The way a man writes when he has been standing all day and has come to the kitchen table at 10 at night to make a record of a thing he did not want to make a record of. The first entry was dated the winter she was 6. Insurance premium for Corbin's first truck. Paid. The second entry was 3 months later. Furnace parts. Halbrook House. Paid. Then another. And another. Grocery run. Halbrook family. Slow winter. Paid. Attorney's retainer for Corbin. Misdemeanor. Paid. School clothes for Corbin. 9th grade. Paid. Winnie turned the page. More. She turned the page. More. She turned the page. The notebook went on like that for the whole binding. Small, careful entries in her father's blueprint, each with a date, an amount, a name, and one word after the amount. Paid, 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 never repaid. She read for a long time, sitting on the cold floor of the workbench room, and the boiler complained beneath the boards, and she did not notice that her feet had gone numb until Ambrose knocked softly on the frame. He did not come in. He looked at the notebook in her hands and asked, gently, if that was her father's. Yes. Grandpa. He nodded once, very slowly, like a man confirming a suspicion he had been carrying for a long time without letting himself name it. He did not ask what was inside. He did not need to. He had watched her father write those numbers for 15 years without letting anyone else see, and he had known, even without seeing, what the numbers were for. Her father, he told her, had never given him the total. Her father had known the total. He knew. Honey, he did not come inside. He shut the door. She heard his cane move down the hall, uneven, patient, going back to his cot. Winnie stayed on the floor. She read until the boiler cycled off, and the house went into that thin, cold hour before dawn when a person hears every board settle. She did not cry. She did not, exactly, feel grief. She felt something colder and more useful. She felt her father, at that same kitchen table, deciding not to confront his sister because confrontation would have cost the thread. He had chosen the thread. He had chosen it every time. And he had written the cost of that choice down in blue pen, quietly, alone, for 15 years, so that his daughter would not have to. She looked at the last page. There was one final entry in a different pen, thinner ink, more recent. The date was 3 weeks before her father's accident. Corbin, $4,000. Business, again. Told him yes because Winnie was in the room. She read that sentence 3 times. Then she closed the notebook. She placed all 3 notebooks in the bottom drawer of Ambrose's workbench, under the strip of shelf paper, exactly where her father had put them, because she was not going to use them yet. She was going to keep them until they mattered. Then she went to bed. She slept the way she had not slept in a month. Not from peace, from the small, clear weight of having something in her hands. Margot came downstairs at 7. She had folded her overnight bag closed and set it by the door, as though she expected to be told to leave. She paid Odette for supper before she poured her own coffee. She read the room agreement Winnie had signed the night before, in the good light of the kitchen window. And then she read it a second time, in silence, because the second reading was the one that counted. She looked up. There was a repair rate on the back. There was... Did Winnie charge herself the repair rate? Only when she did the work. May I? Margot asked. Winnie looked at her aunt's hands. City hands. Careful hands. Hands that had held a color sample against Ambrose's cheek 4 weeks ago and called it agreeable gray. She could strip paint. Winnie decided. Room 5, second floor. Odette would show her where the scrapers were. Margot thanked her. Don't thank me yet. Margot did not thank her. She went upstairs. By 10, she had ruined her blouse. By noon, Odette had given her 3 old bakery shirts and a length of yellow twine to tie her hair back. Margot did not speak much. She learned to score the wallpaper before wetting it. She learned to stop pulling when the plaster began to come with the paper. She paid $30 at the door before she left on Sunday afternoon, and she did not ask when she could come back. She came back Friday. She paid $30 again. She read the board in the kitchen to see which work had been quoted, so she would not step on Raphael's estimates or Odette's cooking hours. And she moved through the house that first weekend like a person who had been trained by decades of appearing at the head of the table to sit, now, at the bottom. She did not stay for supper on the 3rd visit, not because she was not welcome, because she had learned, at long last, to notice that no one at the table was seated for her sake. The article came out 4 weeks after she began. It was a Sunday supplement in a regional magazine. The writer, a woman named Erica Lane, had come through Whitfield to photograph the bridge and had ended up at Odette's diner and had ended up at the boarding house. And she had sat at Winnie's long table on a cold Wednesday and asked questions. Winnie had said one thing 3 times. They hadn't saved it. They were still negotiating. Erica had laughed, then realized Winnie was not joking, and had kept writing. The headline emphasized the $700 anyway. For a week, the phone rang steadily. Strangers asked whether rooms were available. One offered to buy the faded L-Wet sign. A real estate agent left 2 messages about unlocking the site's commercial potential. Winnie erased them. Then, on a Tuesday morning, a white pickup stopped at the curb. Corbin stepped down onto the sidewalk in polished boots. His hair had been cut. His jacket was new. He carried a bakery box from a shop 2 hours east, whose prices were printed on the box in gold. Under his arm, a blue folder. He hugged Ambrose first. Ambrose accepted the hug without returning it. He kissed Winnie on the cheek before she could step out of range. She did not wipe it off. She did not have to. He toured the house with the alert expression he used at job sites. He opened closet doors. He tested a stair rail. He examined the new windows. He asked Raphael what amperage served the upper floor. Enough. Raphael answered without breaking stride. Corbin smiled and remarked that only in a construction town did that answer land. Raphael did not smile back. He walked out of the room without a word, and Winnie watched her cousin register the exit and file it. Quickly, the way a man files a small setback before a pitch. He complimented the long table. He ran his palm across the workbench, and he did not mention the burn. And he did not mention the empty chisel slots. He complimented Uncle Ambrose's work. Ambrose picked up a square. They had done it. In the dining room, Corbin looked out the front windows at the river. This could be something, he mused. Winnie waited. He meant bigger. There it was. He had brought the folder for after supper. Odette made the smallest supper of her career on purpose. Small pot roast, small salad, a cornbread that was, technically, 1 square. She had understood the folder before Corbin had unwrapped it. She had been reading families across a diner counter since 1978. Corbin waited until she began to clear the plates. He opened the folder on the long table. Boutique lodging pitch. 8 guest rooms at premium nightly rates. A cocktail lounge where the dining room now stood. A manager's apartment for Winnie and Ambrose. Tastefully sketched in black and white by a designer whose fees would have covered the boiler twice. His company would manage renovations. His investors would take a controlling interest until their money was cleared. Winnie and Ambrose would contribute the property and receive minority equity. He tapped the last page with one polished nail. The property could finally support her. It did. Really support her. Winnie. It did. No more worrying about boilers and individual rent checks. She knew how to worry about boilers. Corbin smiled. He had a good smile. It had always worked at 19. It still worked at 32. When he did not know, he was being read. Winnie, he began. Corbin. She matched. She was 23. She was 23. She had bought a condemned building on a bus ticket. She had bought a tax-abandoned building at a public auction. She corrected evenly. And it wasn't condemned. Margot was seated at the far end of the table. She had painted the 5th room's trim that day. There was still a fleck of white paint on the underside of her wrist. She had not said a word since Corbin had opened the folder, and Winnie could feel her aunt going very still, the way a person goes still when she recognizes the shape of an argument she has heard, in slightly different words. At every family gathering of her adult life, Corbin turned a page. She would keep ownership on paper. On paper, yes, which was where ownership lived, Winnie observed. On paper, under a signature. He glanced at her once, sharply. That was exactly what it was. Ambrose set down his fork. Odette left the room without pretending not to leave. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and did not go farther, because she was not going to give her boarding house up to anyone that easily. And she had earned over 4 hours of afternoon quiet the previous Sunday. The right to hear this out. Corbin lowered his voice. She was making a permanent decision because she was angry. They had made permanent decisions before they were angry. Winnie answered. They had sold her house. They had loaned him money. They had moved into his parents' basement. Anger might have improved their judgment. Winnie, he began again. She was asking to give a controlling interest in a building she had bought with her own money to a group of investors she had not met, because he had assembled a folder and put his name on the letterhead. It was called financing. Then she did not want financing. He leaned back. She would change her mind when the boiler died. Maybe when the roof failed. Maybe. He was already opening his mouth for the next round when Winnie put her palm flat on the table and let it lie there a moment. She was aware, distantly, of Margot watching, of Ambrose breathing beside her, of the way her cousin's voice had begun to sound the way it had sounded when he was 19 and asking for money. She did not fill the silence for him. When one of these people didn't pay, he tried. That, she reminded him, had already happened. Corbin's mouth tightened. She was going to leave everything to strangers. Then, they were not strangers. She had known them a year. She had known him before he had teeth, Winnie said quietly. Time did not guarantee how a person treated you. That was a hard thing to have learned. From him. Margot bowed her head at the far end of the table. Corbin did not see it. He shifted tack. He was good at that. He had been shifting tack since he was 8 years old. Fine. Let's talk about her. Then. And Uncle Ambrose. She wanted to spend the rest of her life collecting $400 from a night nurse and a lady with a peace lily? Fine. But she had to think about what she left behind. Ambrose spoke for the first time and observed that Corbin always said behind like it was a country they were hiding money in. Corbin ignored him. Winnie. He was her cousin. He was the only cousin she had. Winnie stood up. She left the room. Everyone at the table thought, in that half second, that she was walking out. She was not. She went into the workbench room. She pulled open the bottom drawer of Ambrose's father's workbench. She lifted the strip of shelf paper. She took out the 3 spiral notebooks and the 2 folded photocopies from the bank of the 2 signature slips. And she carried them back to the long table and set them down in front of her cousin. She sat back down. She folded her hands. She did not open the notebooks. She did not have to. Corbin looked at them. What was that? Family accounting. He almost smiled. He was still, at that second, hoping this was a joke. Winnie, my father's... The smile went out of his face slowly, the way a porch light goes out in a house you can no longer see from the road. Margot's head came up. She looked at the notebooks. She looked at her son. She looked at her niece. Her mouth opened once and did not close. Winnie opened the top notebook. She did not read every entry. She read 4 of them. She read them without emphasis, because emphasis would have been an insult to her father's handwriting. Insurance premium for Corbin's first truck, paid. Attorney's retainer for Corbin, misdemeanor, paid. Furnace parts, Halbrook House, paid. Corbin $4,000, business, again. Told him yes because Winnie was in the room. She closed the notebook. She placed the 2 photocopied signature slips beside it, neatly, squarely, as if she were laying down a full house. These were the 2 withdrawals he had signed her name on. Corbin did not answer. $2,500 each, 6 days apart. While they were at the motel, he did not answer. He may have believed her father would never write down what he cost. He may have believed she would never find these notebooks. He may have believed her grandfather would not check the drawer of his own father's workbench because his knees hurt. That was not caution. Corbin, that was contempt. Margot pressed her fist against her mouth. Ambrose sat very still. Winnie took a slow breath. This was what support looked like. When he had received it, that was one document. Here was the second. She tapped the photocopies once. This was what fraud looked like. He did not get to have both in the same family. Corbin's throat moved. He tried, briefly, the smile again. It did not fit. Win. No. Win. Let him explain. He had explained enough, she told him softly, in writing. Over 15 years. He looked at his mother. Margot did not save him. She stood up instead, slowly. One hand pressed to the table's edge. She kept her eyes on the notebooks, not on her son. She kept them there because she was, at that moment, learning something about her brother that she had not been permitted to know while he was alive. She had driven them to that motel. Margot said nobody had asked her. She had paid for 3 nights. She had written 3 nights on the envelope. She had locked the doors of her car when she pulled away. She had heard the locks click. She had known Winnie heard them. She had driven home. And she had told herself Corbin was coming because it was easier to sleep. She did not look at her son yet. She had told herself he would fix it because that was what her brother used to do. Fix things. Quietly. For all of them. She looked, finally, at Corbin. He was the fix her brother had written about. Sweetheart. Corbin closed his eyes. Margot turned back to Winnie. She was so sorry, honey. Winnie let the silence stand. She did not accept the apology. She did not reject it. She let it sit on the table beside the notebooks and the photocopies, and let it earn whatever it could earn on its own weight. Then she stood up. She walked around the table. She put a hand, very lightly, on the back of Margot's chair. Sit down, Aunt Margot. Margot sat. Winnie went back to her seat. She looked at her cousin. She was not going to sign his folder. She told him she was not going to sign anything else he printed. She was not going to pursue him for the 2 2500s. She was not going to send her father's notebooks to his investors. Not because he deserved any of that, because if she did, she made her father's 15 years mean less. Corbin opened his eyes. They were wet. She had not seen them wet since he was a boy. She was cutting him off. He said she was refusing to keep paying him. That was the same thing. No, it was a very specific thing. He could come here as a guest. He could pay for a room, same as his mother did. He could not bring folders. He could not bring investors. He could not sign her name to anything, and he could not, ever again, use the word we to talk about her money. He looked at his mother. His mother was not looking at him. He looked at his uncle. Ambrose met his eyes and did not look away. Corbin picked up the blue folder. He closed it, slowly. He tucked it under his arm. He did not take the bakery box. He walked out of the dining room. He walked out of the front hall. He walked out onto the porch that Winnie had refinished with Wesley the dispatcher on a wet Saturday in October. And he pulled the door closed behind him softly. His white truck started. It backed away from the curb. It disappeared down Riverbend Road towards the bridge. Nobody moved for a long time. Then, Odette, still in the kitchen doorway, made an observation about the pie he had brought. Winnie looked at her. He had paid too much for it. He almost certainly had. Waste was waste. She brought forks. They ate the pie. Nobody celebrated. Ambrose ate 3 bites and pushed his plate to Wesley. Margot ate half of hers and set the fork down and folded her hands in her lap the way she had folded them at her brother's funeral. Raphael took 1 bite and observed, very softly, that it was not bad for a fight, and Estelle laughed once without meaning to. It was the first laugh in the room since the folder had come open. Winnie did not cry until later. She did it lying on her cot, in the parlor, in the dark, and she did it quietly, because she did not want the house to hear. Ambrose reached across the space between the cots and found her hand. They lay that way for a long time. They had done right, he said. Once. That didn't make it feel good. No. The cooperative did not happen in a week. It did not happen in a month. It happened over the winter, in the same slow accumulating way the house itself had happened. Argument by argument, signature by signature, meeting after meeting at the long table with Odette pouring coffee for people she had already decided she would not carry. Raphael wanted his labor credit to count toward a share. Estelle agreed in principle. She wanted an outside estimate to prevent anyone from valuing his own work. Odette insisted that cooking for optional meals should not create ownership in the building. She wanted the right to stop someday without losing anything. Wesley, the dispatcher, wanted a rule that a resident who moved away could not sell a share to just anybody. Sylvie Barron, the pharmacy clerk, who had moved into the 5th room after Margot finished the trim, wanted financial statements every month. Malachi Feld, the machinist who had come in on a temporary contract at the valve factory and had, 90 days later, decided the boarding house was more of a home than any place he had lived. Since 1997, wanted the reserve fund locked behind 2 signatures. They all wanted different things, which was how Winnie knew it was going to work. She listened before she answered. She did that on purpose. It cost her, physically, the effort of not solving each objection the second it landed. She kept her hands flat on the table. She said the same sentence every time she needed to buy herself 30 seconds. Say more, which meant, please, help me not fix you before I understand you. Some nights she went upstairs after a meeting and lay on her back and pressed both palms against her eyes and thought, I am 23 years old. Why am I doing this? And then she thought, because nobody else in this room can. And then she thought, that isn't true. And then she thought, but I am the one they will let. And then she slept. By spring, the shape held. Small monthly contributions. A reserve fund no individual could withdraw without 2 signatures. Shares that returned to the cooperative when a resident left. Winnie and Ambrose retained control of the building for the rest of their lives. After them, the bellwether was not to be sold out from under whoever was still living inside it. Not to an investor, not to a partner, not to a nephew with a folder. Winnie signed the final documents at Ivor Cobb's kitchen table. Ivor's cousin was the lawyer. He had done the work at a rate that was half his usual and had, when Winnie tried to thank him at the end, waved her off. She was keeping a boarding house open in Whitfield. That was his payment. Then he added, quietly, without looking at her, that he had grown up in one of these on Elm in 1971, which was all he said about it, which was enough. Corbin sent $500, then $200, then nothing for 3 months. Winnie did not call. She mailed him a quarterly statement on a Monday in a plain white envelope with the balance printed clearly. Without commentary, she did not include a note. She did not underline anything. She did not. And this was harder than the other decisions. Write his name on the envelope in blue pen. She wrote it in black, because blue pen was her mother's. Blue pen was her aunt's 3 nights. Blue pen was the color of her father's 15 years of paid, and she was not going to give any more of it to Corbin. Margot kept coming. She rented the same room every weekend. She always paid $30. She always read the board. She started spending Saturday mornings scraping something and Saturday afternoons at Ambrose's workbench, sitting on the low stool he had bought at the flea market for $4. With the one remaining chisel, the one Ambrose's father had forged for himself in 1953, in her hand, and a piece of scrap maple between her knees. Ambrose taught her to sharpen it. He did not teach her to speak. He did not teach her to apologize. He taught her the correct angle for the bevel. He taught her how to feel, with the pad of her thumb, the moment the blade grabbed. He taught her the smell of oil on stone. And Margot, who had once picked a color called agreeable gray for Ambrose's basement, sat beside her uncle for hours without speaking and learned, in her 40s, the physical shape of paying attention. That was the thing. That was the forgiveness. If it was forgiveness, Winnie was not always sure what to call it. It was 2 people at a workbench with an old chisel between them, and neither of them pretending anymore that they were doing anything else. In April, Margot rented a small apartment near her office. Winnie helped her make a list of what she needed. Winnie did not offer money. That was the difference. And Winnie thought about it a lot that spring. Help ended when the other person could stand. Rescue kept coming. Her father had taught her about rescue by writing it down for 15 years in blue pen. She was going to try to teach herself about help by leaving margins. The anniversary came in October. The rain returned to Whitfield the way rain always returned to Whitfield in October. Cold. Off the river. Persistent. Odette baked a spice cake after posting the cost sheet on the refrigerator door. Malachi produced a bent brass frame from the valve factory's discard pile, and Sylvie polished the glass with white vinegar until it caught light like a small dark mirror. Raphael found the wet purchase receipt inside the motel envelope. He held it up between 2 fingers. $700. The ink had bled at one corner where Winnie's thumb had held it a full year ago, in the rain, under the awning. He set the receipt inside the brass frame. He looked at Winnie. Front desk. Not there. Where? Winnie looked around the front hall. At the small oak desk Ambrose had built from paneling salvaged out of the dining room. At the jar of peppermints Odette denied refilling. At the peg where the extra keys hung. At the notebook where every resident's monthly rent was logged in her own careful print. By the door, she decided, where a person could see it before they signed anything. Ambrose nailed the frame to the wall. He hung it slightly crooked on the first try. Raphael tilted his head. Ambrose adjusted it. Everyone stood back. Odette pretended not to have an opinion. She had an opinion. Ambrose adjusted it again. Winnie stood next to him, and their shoulders touched. She did not speak. From the dining room, she could hear the scrape of chairs. Wesley telling somebody to keep a hand off the cake. Odette laughing, the low creased laugh she saved for the last hour of the day. The boiler complained under the boards, the way old boilers complain when they are asked to work again. Margot came down the stairs. She was carrying, in both hands, a small wooden crate she had found that morning at the back of Winnie's father's storage unit, outside Richfield, on her way through Ohio. She had driven the extra 90 miles without telling Winnie. She had paid the storage bill herself. She had loaded the crate into her car and driven the rest of the way with it, belted into the passenger seat like a child. She set the crate on the long table. She opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in the same yellowed newspaper Winnie had used to pack it in the farmhouse a year and 1 week before, was her mother's flowered serving bowl. Winnie stopped breathing. She had not thought about the bowl in months. She had thought she had lost it. In the storage unit, in the move, in the winter, in the whole slow shedding of the house she had come from. She had made peace with losing it, or she had thought she had, and now here it was on the table in front of her, and she found out, in one small dark second, that she had never made peace with it at all. Margot stepped back. She had found it in the second row, under a box of Winnie's father's tax returns. Winnie touched the rim of the bowl. The faded flowers were exactly where they had always been. Her mother's fingerprints were not on it. They had not been on it for 15 years. And yet, in the way the eye trains itself to find the shape of the people it has loved, Winnie could almost see her mother's hand around it, lifting mashed potatoes at Thanksgiving in 2008. She lifted the bowl out of the crate. She set it on the long table between the spice cake and the coffee pot. Odette placed a small stack of pears in the bowl without asking. Malachi added 3 apples. Sylvie brought a handful of walnuts from the pantry and let them fall gently around the fruit. The bowl filled without anyone speaking. Winnie looked at her aunt. Margot did not look back yet. She was still standing at the edge of the table with her hands empty, and she did not know where to put them. She had brought back the last thing she owed, and now she did not know what her hands were for. Winnie reached into her pocket. She took out the Motel envelope. The paper had gone very soft at the folds over the year. The blue writing on the front, 3 nights, was faint. The list on the back was full, the ink of it running down both sides in her own hand. 700 for the house. 86 for the bus times, 2. 54 for a new deadbolt. 100 for the electrician deposit. 325 for the roof. 250 for Percy, unpaid. Still, she placed the envelope on the table. She slid it under the base of the flowered bowl until only one edge was showing. She looked at her aunt. Her aunt had written this. Yes, Winnie had kept it. Margot could see that. Winnie was going to keep it under this bowl. For as long as she owned this house. Margot's mouth opened. Winnie held up her hand. Not because she was punishing her. She said because she did not want to forget what a person could survive. And she did not want to forget who was in the room. Margot swallowed. She did not sit down. She did not step away. She was crying, but she was crying the way an adult woman cries when she has finally decided she is not going to leave. Her shoulders did not shake. Her mouth did not open. 2 tears simply moved down her face, and she did not wipe them. "Aunt Margot," Winnie said quietly. "Yes." "Sit down." Margot sat. Winnie sat. Ambrose came around the table and sat between them without a word. Odette placed the spice cake in the center of the table beside the floured bowl. Wesley cut the first slice, because his shift started at 4 in the morning, and he was allowed by unanimous vote to eat first. Raphael cut the second, because he had rewired the whole ground floor twice and had earned, he insisted, a bigger slice than seemed decent. Sylvie cut Estelle's for her because Estelle was on shift until 11 and had made everyone promise, on pain of professional consequences, to save her a piece. They passed the plates. Nobody made a speech. Winnie thought later that this was the mercy of the house, that nobody, not once, made a speech. They ate. They argued about the cost of pears. They accused Odette of watering down the coffee. Malachi told a story about a valve that had exploded in Toledo in 1994, and it was a story they had all heard 3 times, and they let him tell it anyway. Because at the boarding house, you did not interrupt a man's third telling of a valve story, because someday it was going to be your third telling of something. After supper, Ambrose went to the workbench room. He did not turn on the overhead light. He turned on the small lamp Raphael had wired for him in December, the one that had a green glass shade and threw a warm circle over the maple top. Winnie came in after him. He was sitting on the low stool, the single remaining chisel in his hand, turning it over slowly the way he had turned it over that first night. He looked up. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the auction rain a year ago, before she had raised the number. Honey. Yes. Morale. She thought about it. She thought about the flowered bowl on the long table. She thought about the motel envelope under it, half showing, in her own hand and her aunt's. She thought about the framed receipt beside the door. $700, hung slightly crooked and then adjusted and adjusted again. She thought about Estelle putting 2 fingers against her grandfather's wrist and telling him to sit. She thought about Odette walking upstairs without slamming the door and then coming back down to tie her apron on again. She thought about Raphael pushing the notebook back across the table with his knuckle and telling her that now she had a house. She thought about her father's blue pen. 15 years of paid, and one last line about her being in the room, and the way that line was going to sit in her chest for the rest of her life. She thought about Margot at the workbench beside her grandfather, learning the correct bevel on a chisel her own great-grandfather had never known her. She thought about Corbin's white truck disappearing down Riverbend Road. She thought about the 2 forged signatures, filed now in her safe deposit box at the branch downtown, and about the fact that she had chosen not to use them, and about how the choosing not to had cost her something and also given her something back. She thought about the raccoon on the stairs on their first day. She thought about the rain. She thought about being 23 and about the strange, quiet dignity of not being rescued. She looked at her grandfather. Good. Grandpa. His eyes filled. He did not cry. He nodded. Once. Very small. And he set the chisel down in its slot on the maple top, exactly where it belonged. The empty slots beside it were still empty. That was all right. The empty slots were also part of the record. She kissed the top of his head. She turned off the lamp. She stood in the doorway of the workbench room a moment longer, looking at the shape of her grandfather in the last light from the hall. And then she stepped out into the front hall, where the framed receipt hung crooked on the wall, and the $700 auction slip caught the porch light from the window. The porch light was on. Winnie had turned it on that afternoon, and she had left it on purpose, because she wanted the light to be visible from the sidewalk, and from the fence, and from the road, and from the far side of the river, and from wherever. On any given cold night, a person with a suitcase and no plan might be looking for a doorway. Outside, the fog was lifting off the water. The maple by the foundation, which they had finally paid a crew to remove in March, was gone. In its place, Ambrose had planted a small dogwood that had already put out one thin white bloom in April and would put out more next year if it survived the winter. Winnie stepped onto the porch. She pulled her coat around her shoulders. Behind her, through the door, she could hear Odette laughing at something Wesley had said, and she could hear Margot, quietly, asking Estelle if the pattern on the salt shaker was original to the diner or if it had come from a garage sale. And she could hear Ambrose in the workbench room clearing his throat, the way he cleared his throat when he was about to stand up and pretend his knee had not stiffened. She could hear her house, because it was, now, her house. Not the way a deed made a thing yours, the way a year of it made a thing yours, the way a burst pipe made a thing yours, the way an argument about cooking made a thing yours, the way saying no to a blue folder in front of a room full of witnesses made a thing yours, the way choosing, on a wet Sunday in October, to plant a dogwood where a maple had been, made a thing yours. She looked out at the river. The lights of a barge moved slowly downstream. Somewhere on the far bank, a dog was barking at a train that was still a mile away. The wind lifted, once, and shook the loose flashing at the eave of the boarding house. Once, twice, 3 times. Winnie smiled. She thought, for the first time in a year, without any small dark half of her disagreeing, I am home. She did not say it out loud. She did not have to. She stood on the porch a little longer. She listened to the boiler complain, and the residents laugh, and the river carry the dogwood shadow along the wall of the front hall. Then she went back inside. She closed the door behind her softly, not because anyone was sleeping, but because the door of a boarding house that has finally become a home is a door you close softly, out of respect. She hung the key on the peg. She wiped her